Hello and welcome to Kiwi Reviewers First Impressions, where I break down my initial thoughts on a recently released movie before I go fully in depth. Now for Dune, I had a whole thing planned when the third movie came out, so I was gonna refrain from mentioning it, but my hand was forced by a truly atrocious review by Kate Rogers, so here we are. I hope you enjoy. So to start, I did like a good amount of the film. For example, I like what was set up for a sequel, I like Paul's conflict at the start of the movie, I like some of the payoffs, like Paul getting the Fremen army to fight against the Great Houses with him, or him and Jessica getting the blue eyes. I like the tense scenes with Chani and Paul. I like the first action scene against the spice silo, keyword being first, which is one of the only well-directed action scenes. And I liked what they did with Gurney for the most part in this film. I also like the one real interaction Paul and Jessica have in this film, since their dynamic was really well done in the first film, and they carry it into this. Just a shame they don't do too much more with it, but more on that later. So my problem with Paul in this film, like all the other characters we'll discuss, is simply a matter of time spent. So when we left Paul, he had just accepted the burden of his role, as he knew it would help him obtain the revenge he desired. And my problem here is that he has a few character arcs he needs to get through, and they're almost all horribly rushed. Firstly, he needs to gain the trust of the Fremen, which he does by getting one victory against the Harkonnen. And you'd think an outsider who just inserted himself in because Stilgar thinks he's the Lisa Nagaib would need more than one victory, showing he's a good fighter, something the Fremen from the north were told about when he showed up, and could tell because he killed Jarmus, and didn't care because he's an outsider. Honestly, they should have simply waited until he rode the worm to let them have faith in him, because when he rides Shai Hulud, he proves he's one of them conclusively. Then we have Chani falling for him, which is also rushed, but to be fair, this is a sci-fi fantasy, not a romance, so I'm fine with surface level, but they do not end it in a satisfying way. More on that in the Chani section. Then we have him fully becoming the Kwisatz Haderach, and I can't believe they got away with it being this rushed. The section in the movie when he is told to go to the south and decides not to because he's scared of fulfilling his destiny is around 3 minutes at most. And the problem is, both that it makes his arc feel undercooked. Although that being said, at least Paul's arc was building off a strong foundation, so while it wasn't great, there are definitely still good elements, unlike some of the other arcs in this film. So the problem with Chani is that she has no base to build off, so they have to set up her character and develop it here. And since this film is far more plot-focused than character-focused like the first film was, it leads to Chani feeling like a very weak character. So my problem with her is while you can fill in the gaps on what she's feeling as a viewer, almost nothing is actually shown to us. Firstly, why she fell for Paul, as mentioned earlier, has no reason provided. Just, he has gone swimming? And that is hot to her? That's my best guess. But at the very least, that is an established thing with stories like this, in that the main love interest will fall for the main character for pretty unexplained reasons. What grinds my gears is her fallout with him. So the problem is, in the 3-minute scene I mentioned before, she convinces him to go to the south, even though he told her earlier that if he goes to the south, he will fulfill his destiny, and yet when he fulfills his destiny, she's mad at him and shouts at his mother for getting him to become the Lisa Nagaib. And before you try and tell me, but she said to Paul that he would never lose her as long as he stayed who he was. The problem is that he is the same as he was at the start and the middle, giving his speeches with the same cadence and almost the same vocab, just instead of saying he's a Fremen, he's saying he's the Lisa Nagaib, which is not enough of a change for that line to be a justification. And while I can fill in the blanks for the movie, a good story can give you enough to where you don't have to hardcore reach to make a character's arc make sense. And the scene where she stays behind, while we know that she finds Arrakis beautiful, and while we can guess she's mad at Paul for wedding the Emperor's daughter, we can never hear her make any comment. So this is all us as the audience writing the film for it, which is the most pure illustration of artistic laziness. Jessica suffers from pretty much the same issue as Paul in this film. We know from the first film she wants Paul to become the Kwisatz Haderach, but here, since she isn't partaking in much of the action, she does very little character-wise. I think the best example to illustrate this is at the start of the film, she is talking to her unborn daughter and saying they need to convert the Fremen, and then they cut to Paul, and then they cut back to Jessica later, and suddenly she has a following. No idea how she got it, and again, we can guess, but the film needs to give us information, not just have us write it for the writers. Besides that, Paul and Jessica only have one meaningful interaction, and while I think it is really good, it just shows how much potential this film had, but due to their choice to focus more on action and wasting their time on introducing a new Harkonnen, more on that later, Jessica is just going through the motions to make Paul the Messiah, with her not having any developed motivation. Another example is she tries to console Chani, and we get no reason for her to do this. Is it because she's a good sport? She knows Paul cares about her? Chani is still part of the plan? Who knows, because the movie never tells us, and therefore making it just so much less compelling to you as an audience member. Next up, we have the Bene Gesserit, and I'll be real, while I'm sure all they do in this film will pay off next film, they actually just come off as filler here. They spend the film talking about Paul's power, having the Emperor's daughter see new Harkonnen guy, and then getting dunked on by Paul at the end. Like, if you cut the Bene Gesserit out of this film, and replace it with more Chani as Jessica moments, this film could have got so much better. But to be fair, I don't know how all this stuff will pay off in the next film, which is a disadvantage of me doing this now. So of course, if the third film's payoffs are awesome, then feel free to disregard my desire to cut them out. But even so, in this film as a standalone, the Bene Gesserit are just a brigade of veiled clowns who talk about scheming but accomplish nothing. I have many problems with the Harkonnen in this film, so let's jump into them. Firstly, and most importantly, why does Feyd-Rautha even exist? He only exists to have an Harkonnen for Paul to fight at the end of the movie, but they already had a nephew of the Baron who was intimidating, Rabban. So introducing a new one, who dies here anyway, just pads the runtime and adds nothing. And also, because of his existence, Rabban has turned into an utter clown, who not only, in his only encounter with Paul, runs away almost instantly, but dies to Gurney after 2 attacks. And finally, and I will go into this more substantially when I cover the whole series, but the flares on the Harkonnen ships are utterly stupid. They have absolutely broken offensive capabilities, and at no point does the movie ever put limits on the flares. So for example, in the first scene, where they send infantry to attack the Fremen, it's hard to get into it, because you think, why don't they just use the flares and kill the Fremen? And then you don't have to risk your troops' lives. And in the final action scene, how did the Harkonnen ships, designed to fly on Arrakis, manage to miss all the Fremen on the Worms, which are such obvious targets, because it loses flight control for some reason? And besides that, the way the Baron dies is utterly unsatisfying. Paul just calls him his grandfather, stabs him in the neck, and moves on, which again shows the pacing of this movie just being far too off for it to work. Finally, the reveal of Paul being part Harkonnen goes nowhere, because it is right at the end, and Paul has too many people to kill/marry for them to properly explore the shocking revelation. So it is just kind of on the table doing nothing, and they can't really explore it in the next movie, because the 3 most important Harkonnen are all dead without the movie doing anything with this concept around said deaths. So overall, is this a bad film? Nah. But it had infinite potential, but due to them trying to cram too much bullshit into one movie, it ended up feeling rushed and undercooked. That being said, I am still going to watch the last film, and when it's out, I'm still going to make a more in-depth review of this whole series. So see you then, guys.